To Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, June 30th, 2021. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm also of counsel at ComLaw Group. Very excited to have each of you here today on Zoom or on our live streaming platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And this is, for the month of June, kind of our fifth of a series of sessions in which we're talking about digital infrastructure investment. This is in preparation for, or as a lead up to, the Broadband Communities Summit in September. Things are finally opening up as my guest and I were chatting about before this began. We're beginning to see conferences live. I attended my first conference 2 months ago live. The WISP America session. There's going to be more Fiber Connect. I'm hearing lots about that in about 4 weeks' time. And of course, Broadband Communities coming up in Houston in September. And at Broadband Communities Summit, our organization, Broadband Breakfast, will be hosting a special event for the second year in a row called Digital Infrastructure Investment. This is a half-day summit focused on bringing together the financial and broadband communities. In the chat message, I'll just shoot over the URL for this session so you can learn a little bit more about it. We're kind of structured around a theme of exploring innovations in the wholesale and open access business models, talking a lot about infrastructure investment and the funding process, which of course has been transformed over the past 6 months as we've absorbed, it seems, wave after wave of proposed federal legislation and dollars in this area. And then the third being shared infrastructure, both in terms of real assets and how those assets are moving into the core networks. So those are kind of the three broad topics we'll be addressing, and our agenda and program will continue to evolve and be posted on the site 3 months ahead. But we do encourage you to register now for the event. It is, as I say, at the Broadband Communities Summit, and through Broadband Breakfast and our partnership with Broadband Communities, you can get the special best rate, $349 to attend the summit in person. If you're not able to make it to Houston, you can join the Broadband Breakfast Club and attend the event, the Digital Infrastructure Investment, virtually for $149. And of course, each of these includes your first month of Broadband Breakfast Club membership. We're very excited to have launched this. It is available. We have extended our founders members rate, $49 a month through the end of July. And so we hope you will learn more about the benefits of becoming a Broadband Breakfast Club member and continue to come to these events, Broadband Breakfast Live Online. So just to kind of maybe recap the sessions that we've had so far this month of June, we had a discussion on June 2nd about rural roll-ups and how the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund has accelerated or driven new developments in the merger and acquisition space. We talked about investment implications of broadband infrastructure legislation. That was a conversation with Chris Mitchell of Institute for Local Self-Reliance and myself on June 9th. We had a very good panel discussion on the question of innovation in broadband business models through open access networks. That was on June 16th. And then last week, we had a great discussion about roads, bridges, and broadband, the interplay between physical and digital infrastructure. Today, we do hope we'll also be able to speak about some aspects involving digital real estate investment trusts and real assets. But we're also going to take a broader look and focus a little bit more on some of the different models that are out there for federal broadband legislation. And so with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and introduce our guest. I'm very happy to welcome Doug Dawson to be with us here today. Doug, for those of you who don't know him, is very well known in the industry, is the president of CCG Consulting, and he has worked in the telecom industry since 1978, both from a consulting and operational background. And I probably know Doug best through his Pots and Pans blog, which he does every business day. So I can relate, Doug. And we put out content on Broadband Breakfast every business day, and Doug does his own blog post. And his piece today just really caught my eye. It's titled, and we should have this on our page very soon. It's titled "The Infrastructure Guessing Game." In fact, it is on the site. Thank you to our support team who works and puts these things on the site on the fly. We've got a link to it on this page on Broadband Breakfast, and he talks about what we're all talking about. That is to say, what is going on with the broadband infrastructure package and legislation. So with that, Doug, let me go ahead and turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and some of the work you've been doing generally. But do please give us the core of your observations and the different legislative frameworks that you've seen out there as far as broadband infrastructure.
Sure. Thank you, Drew. So I'm Doug Dawson. I work out of Asheville, North Carolina. Our company is a full-service consulting firm. We probably got into digital before anyone else. We went virtual 20 years ago because 20 years ago we had better broadband at each of our homes than we could get at our office in DC. And so we all went home. We're now scattered all over the country, and it's an interesting way to work. So our consulting firm does everything. Lately, what we've been completely subsumed in is answering questions about ARPA funding and the NTIA grants coming up. We're working on a bunch of those. So this is just, I've heard from literally dozens of communities who all of a sudden want to do a feasibility study so they can go spend money in these various grants. So this grant funding has completely woken up just about every community in the United States. So it's a really crazy time to be a consultant. The idea of, we know that the federal government's trying to do another giant infrastructure program with a giant piece for broadband. And so what we don't know right now is what the heck that might look like. And so, what we do know is in the past, just this year, there's been two very major broadband bills introduced in the House and Senate. The first one was the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. That was an $80 billion broadband infrastructure program, and it largely was going to award the money in one giant $60 billion plus reverse auction. That bill was introduced by Representative James Clyburn and by Senator Amy Klobuchar. And so, that is, and of course, after that was awarded, after that was discussed, or that came out around the same time as the actual last reverse auction closed, and all of a sudden people have a whole lot of problems with some of the things that popped up in that auction. So I don't think that idea has as much merit among the talking heads in Washington as it used to. We're certainly not hearing nearly as much support for it. Meanwhile, a second act was just reintroduced. This is the second year it's been acted, and it's called the Bridge Act, which is the Broadband Reform and Investment to Drive Growth in the Economy Act, which thankfully they condensed down to the Bridge. And that was introduced by Michael Bennet, a senator from a Democrat, Angus King, an independent, and Rob Portman, a Republican. So this one, this is the second year. It's got much broader support. This one is only for $40 billion, and it also is interesting in that it talks about mostly giving the money to the states and letting the states decide what to do with it. So that, that's two very different ideas now running through Congress. And those two ideas are still very different than what the current funding that's going on that came out through the current stimulus plan, the RPA stuff. And so, what we know is really going on, and whether either of those ideas or anything else survive is really up in the air. What we know about the infrastructure plan so far is that there was a bipartisan group of senators who have introduced their own version of it. It's hard to think that because that was a bipartisan one, that some of the provisions of some of these acts, these acts really stress the idea of low cost income, which very well may survive, but they also, they talked about, allowing municipal competition. It's hard to think in a bipartisan bill that would survive. So what we think is really going on is pretty much every major topic related to how you would give broadband money out is probably on the table right now. I'm picturing every lobbyist in the world is very actively trying to get the senators to get their ideas into whatever a broadband plan looks like. And so I don't imagine it's going to look like either one of those two bills. It's going to be something brand new. We know that the White House proposed $100 billion broadband plan, but they didn't really have a lot of details in it. They simply said, we think this will supply a lot of the needs for the country, but they were very, very short on details. But we kind of know what the White House likes because we think that they've been heavily influencing the ARPA funding rules and the NTIA funding rules. And those rules are very different than past grants. They're talking about a very relaxed definition of 25.3 that allows money to be spent for urban, dead zones for broadband. That's not necessarily just for rural anymore. We know that there's a lot of money being talked about for low income relief. And so, the White House is, and the White House plan is clearly, the White House clearly likes the idea of 100 by 100 as a minimum speed for broadband, which really starts talking about fiber or maybe a few other technologies like Verizon's fiber to the curb that they're using. So there's only a few technologies that'll meet the 100 by 100. And so, so we think that's where the White House is at. But of course, the White House doesn't write these bills. The Congress is going to be the one to finally put together the actual details of the legislature. And in fact, the White House has been completely mum about what is in the compromise, bill already. They're making no statements whatever about the details of broadband. So we think it's probably already changed. But it doesn't really matter what it's changed to, because between now and the time, if we even get a broadband bill, because there's still this big fight about whether the bipartisan bill will ever get passed. If not, there could be a fallback Democratic bill, and they're still not sure they have 50 senators vote for that. So, I mean, we may get no broadband plan this year. So, I mean, there couldn't be anything more up in the air than this. I mean, there's literally a news article on the web about this plan now about every hour.
Well, so, facts are changing on the ground.
Yes, they are.
As we speak. So yeah, you've given a lot out there that I think would be good for us to dive into a little bit here. And so let's start with different models for spending broadband funds, infrastructure funds. So I'm going to put four out here, okay? And then we can sort of supplement and elaborate them. And so one model was pioneered by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the 2009 Obama-Biden administration. And it was basically a form of competitive grants. There was a loan component to some of it, but for the most part of the $7.2 billion that went to broadband of the 2009 stimulus, most of that was distributed by the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, through this process of competition. And states had some input, but it was still a national level decision. Okay, so that's one model. Let's just call it out there. It hasn't been sort of squarely identified for this, but let's get that out there. The second one is the reverse auction model. Okay, and you have kind of highlighted some maybe the blooms off the rose a little bit, but let's talk about why. Why should that be the case? Because before some potentially troublesome or problematic candidates were awarded funds through the latest Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction, RDOF was talked about quite favorably, right? Or the reverse auction process was talked about quite favorably. So let's just explore that, Doug. Are there ways to fix that, i.e., either by having minimum thresholds, i.e., if we defined 100 as the floor, then when would a rural digital would a reverse auction approach be a good one? You've mentioned third approach here is the Bridge Act approach, and you're basically, this is just purely punt to the states, right? I mean, in some ways it's a It's a kind of an old Republican idea, right? Block grants. It's a kind of concession that there's going to be politics in this no matter what. And so might as well just punt it to a level down and let the politics happen at the state level. So again, maybe I've been a little too flippant in characterizing that, but I would like to get your thoughts on the block grant versus those other two approaches. And then maybe just the fourth one is use an existing paradigm, right? Use an existing, source. And this is kind of what's happened with the emergency broadband benefit and the emergency connectivity fund. I mean, they basically just supercharged the existing, Lifeline program and the existing E-rate, libraries and schools program. It's basically shoved, 3.2 or 7.1 billion more than is normally available through normal universal service fund costs through those two existing programs. Maybe there's some tweaks on the margin. Obviously, there's more money, $50 instead of $10 per month through the new and improved Lifeline emergency broadband benefit. But it's using an existing paradigm, right? i.e. the FCC and the Universal Service Administrative Corporation system. So those are kind of like four ideas on the table. And I don't know if that exhausts the field, Doug, but what do you think kind of from a theoretical standpoint? Is it better to kind of have a national competitive approach, the first one? Is it better to auction it off, what economists really like and have been pushing and promoting, or just kind of nakedly give it to the states and let them make a decision based on their political considerations, or use something existing like USAC's programs through the Universal Service Fund?
My ideal structure, if they gave it to me, which of course no one in their right mind would ever do, but I would do some of each, because they supercharged some of the existing grants this year. So the first idea of using traditional, do your engineering, do a business plan, apply for the grant. Well, they've supercharged the Reconnect program this year with more dollars. There's the $3 billion NTIA grants. And so those are traditional grants. There's no reason that they couldn't give out more federal money to those. Those kind of grants are the safest from the perspective of the government, because they're blessed by engineers. They can show the numbers work. They ask for the right amount of money, and that also allows them to be audited later and be accountable. And accountability is a big issue with these grants. The original ARA stuff, 10 years ago, there was very little follow-up accountability on a lot of those grants. And so the problem of, and so that's really the fourth category, using the existing programs who are used to doing it. It's hard to picture doing a $65 billion grant that way, because there's just not enough good reviewers for that many grants. And that's really the problem we had 10 years ago with stimulus money. A lot of those grants ended up being terrible grants because the people reviewing them didn't have a good enough eye to pick out the winners and the losers. If those kind of grants are done properly, they really work. The USDA has been doing those kind of grants forever. They've rarely done a bad project. And so if you put a really thorough review on a good grant application, you can have a pretty good assurance it'll work. If we go do 65 billion of them all at once, it could be a disaster. And so, there's just not enough time to do that many shovel-ready projects. That's the other issue. That's a lot of shovel-ready projects. The idea of the reverse auction, I have a long list of problems there. The number one issue that no one even talked about the last time is the FCC decided ahead of time, before it even started, how much money went to every county. That's the huge step where they made all the screw-ups. They didn't spend nearly enough money to Appalachia, and they put way too much money in the plains. And so the plains had all these people going after the grant money. Nobody went after it in West Virginia because they didn't put enough money in it. And so, so the FCC, a federal agency, has no business deciding how much it costs, because we do studies all the time, and two counties next door to each other can be 50% different in cost, even if the geography is similar, just because of the condition of the poles and all sorts of issues, right? And so for somebody to arbitrarily decide ahead of time, that's the biggest problem with the reverse auction. The other problem with the reverse auction is they left in unqualified companies to win a lot of money who will probably never pull it off. They let people bid on technologies that don't actually exist. I mean, there's three big winners of gigabyte rural broadband. There's no such thing. There's not going to be such thing. It's not going to work like that. They're going to give, people are going to get something less for that money. They will get something. It just won't be gigabit wireless.
Let's drill a
Yes.
little bit more into the
Yes.
reverse auction concept, and let's
Yes.
postulate, okay, that the two problems get fixed. One problem being,
They
there's
pre-qualify.
the
Yes.
pre-qualification, and the second problem being, like, let's get out of this 25-3 world,
Yes.
ASAP, right, and redefine. So if we had a big pot of money, if we had a 65 billion pot of money through a reverse auction, are there scalability issues, Doug, or not, right? Because there clearly are scalability issues on the other systems we've talked about. But could you, now there's probably two questions, right? One is how we define the areas that are up for auction,
Right.
and you've
Right.
figured a problem there. But maybe the reverse side of that is, like, let's just say if we were to, get fiber to every home or close to every home in the country. Doug, what's your estimate for how much that would cost, right? I mean, is it going to be many orders more than 65 billion, or could that put a dent, or a complete, if you will, close to complete dent in the problem?
Well, the problem is if we throw 25.3 out and now we start talking about real speeds that you're going to get with fiber, that opens up a whole new world. It opens up all those inner city neighborhoods where the cable company never built. It opens up all the county seats where the cable companies are really lousy. So all of a sudden it opens up a much bigger universe than what we've been looking at currently, because we're just looking at solving the rural problem. Well, there's a lot more people who don't have broadband in urban areas than there is in rural areas. So, we have to, if we're really going to solve it, we have to solve all of it. And so I think the problem is way more than 65 billion, but I don't see, I don't know that grants are really needed to build county seats. So the point is they need to get fiber. And if somebody builds, take a typical rural county, if somebody builds fiber all around the county seat and the county seat is left with inferior broadband, they're going to find a solution for it somehow or the other, right? So, so maybe that doesn't have to be a big federal grant program. But there is a way bigger number than 65 billion that it takes to get everybody fiber. It's way bigger than that. But the problem is, nobody knows, because it's this idea of going, county X is going to get $65 million allocated. The problem is, in a reverse auction, if that's the wrong number, it's the wrong number.
So let's talk about how we get that number. So if we take out the 25.3 and say, okay, so we're going to put in the map, okay, we're going to put 100, anything that isn't, verifiably 100, we're going to make it available. How are the cost determinants going to be? And this is really getting into the weeds, Doug, but this is a crucial question. I know you've got expertise in this. So what would be a way to make sure the numbers are right? That is to say, this is the right level of support that the FCC or whoever should be giving for service. That is to say, for building out something that is not 100 to an area that doesn't have it.
Well, we know the answer. That's the first thing I talked about. That's doing an engineered study and going, in this county for this footprint, it cost me 14 million. Here's the proof. That's how you do it. The FCC uses this theoretical cost model, and it just doesn't work. It's dreadful. It's never worked. It really wasn't meant to do this. It was really meant as an allocator for universal service funds years ago. And all of a sudden you go, oh, let's just use that same model and give county X 14 million and county Y 80 million. It's like, no. It doesn't work like that. So we can't do it with a theoretical model, because there's no such model. You can't build such a model, because it's literally, fiber prices vary neighborhood by neighborhood. They really do. Just a real micro example, I had just helped a county where 85% of it is farmland, 15% of it is a river bottom. The costs in the river bottom are like 4 times higher than they are in the farmland. And the theoretical models are just not going to understand that. And of course, the river bottoms where everybody lives. And so, but it was still rural. And so it just, You can't,
Well,
can't
is
figure
there some
that stuff out theoretically. Yeah.
is there some alternative model, or is this a non-scalable solution
It's a
we just
non-scalable solution for the feds to figure those numbers out. You know, the idea, the White House original plan was 100 million over 8 years. So they were talking about having traditional grant filings for 8 years, which gave people time to build the business plans and make the filings. That gets you the right number. It never wastes money, but it also doesn't the problem with using the reverse auction is, again, in Appalachia, they underestimated the money. And so, that allows you to fix both the overestimation and the underestimation. Everybody is going to have the chance to get the right amount of money for their solution. It also allows us to bring in judgments. I mean, we studied a county in New Mexico recently where the whole county would cost like $70 million to build, but the last 200 people were like 20% of that number. And the answer is maybe we don't build those last 20% with fiber. I mean, that's a perfect solution for satellite broadband. I mean, the cost was, $80,000 a home or some crazy number, right? The traditional grant lets you deal with that kind of stuff as well. Like, do we really want to do this? Yeah, and I don't think that feds have ever said every single home in America gets broadband. We want to get to 99 something percent, right? But that last 1% is incredibly expensive. So,
right.
And so, so we can deal with those sort of things in real grant filings. I still like traditional grant filings. But now your third item of giving it to the states, that's really interesting because some states will do a bang up job. We saw a little version of this with CARES money. CARES money ran down to the states, and even states who didn't have a broadband office like Vermont, they quickly had a complete working coalition of every stakeholder in the state, from the governor's office, the state commission, the ISPs were in there, a whole bunch of concerned citizens, and they figured something out. So the fact is, you give the states the money, they're going to figure something out. But we also have states, I live in North Carolina, most of the money is going to go to Charter here. And if you go to California, it's going to go to Frontier and AT&T. Regardless of, every state has their own politics. You said it in your intro. States are going to decide very different solutions. But I don't know if there's anything wrong with that. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, two follow-ups, and thanks for bringing the states in. I mean, as we talk through this, there's a lot more advantages than maybe meets the eye in that approach because it is offloading some of the decision making to the laboratory, laboratory of democracy of our different state governments. It's a core feature of American polity and political and economic life. And so what's wrong, so to speak, with making those decisions at a state level and allowing different models to work? But we're getting a lot of questions or comments in the question board on Zoom. Thank you for that. And you can also make your comments through the other platforms too. We hope to pay attention to those. Doug, you can see these questions too. I want to focus on what Dan McKim has said. Why can't we promote redefining the obvious? The goal must be fiber to the premises in a distributed governance infrastructure ownership model as much as any incumbent model. In other words, unless and until the goal of FTTP is akin to our highways, airways, waterways model of access, we cannot rest, regardless of how much fiber runs past your homes, schools, institutions, or business. I'm very sympathetic to that. I'd love your take, Doug, on this. And is there a case for saying, look, let's just get conduit, right? Let's just get the core out there, and then find ways to enable competition, the private sector to build off of those conduit or dark fibers or lit fibers. So anyway, your thoughts on this, Doug?
That model doesn't work unless you just stop there, either probably at conduit, because even dark fiber may not be harder to do. You can't do that model if you're looking for partners who are putting any equity into it, because if you want any private company to put equity into help building the network, let's say a 50% federal grant, a 50% matching, They are not going to do that if it's going to be open access. It's just not going to happen. Nobody's going to build that network. Maybe municipalities would accept that deal, but no commercial ISP is going to do it. Now, if you just build dark fiber or conduit and allow anybody to use it, the problem we have there is there's a whole lot of country where there's no real obvious ISPs. When every ISP ran out again to serve the places they could, what happens to the places where nobody shows up? Now, you said maybe over time ISPs will grow because we have a history in this country. Look how we had a just giant boom, years ago, and people who opened dial-up ISPs, and then we had a boom recently of people who opened wireless ISPs. So if you build the infrastructure, we probably would have a boom and people who would operate on that as well. But they still have to put money into it, and little startup moms and pops don't really have the money necessarily to jump in and actually be a fiber-based ISP. So it's an interesting model. The other issue is if you only build it where it's not today, you still have all these pockets where people have already made the private investments, and I don't know how you mesh all that together. You have, in one county, you'll have pockets of open access, pockets of cable company, pockets of a co-op that already built, and it becomes a real mishmash network. Honestly, if you're going to do that, you go to the Supreme Court and see if they will approve nationalizing the whole thing and start over. But
Doug, there certainly was an open access requirements on the middle mile networks that were funded under the Recovery Act of 2009. What did that work or not work? What's your take on that?
Well, that didn't work in many cases because back to the issue of very, very badly thought out grants that shouldn't have been approved, that we really did build fiber routes to nowhere in some cases. There were also people who built those grant monies, never got any revenues and folded. And so there's, there's fiber routes that were built under that no one's offering. There were also fiber routes built under that were just superb. There's one in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. There's one in Northern Minnesota that has absolutely bailed out the region. And so some of those middle mile routes spectacularly did exactly what they were hoping for. But middle mile is hard to make work. And so even though they were grant funded, some of them still didn't work. But the concept was good. But middle mile is okay for middle mile fiber open access because, there's no customers on it. It's just endpoints. And so, ISPs very often come and do it. West Virginia turned around and gave the middle mile route from that grant to Frontier, who then closed it to open access. I mean, you get all sorts of very weird local reactions to those things. So
let's drill a little bit more into how the private sector gets involved, right? Or obviously it's pretty clear. So again, let's just go back to these four frameworks, right? And the first one being competitive grants. Obviously, there were private companies that could bid on the grants. Well, let me be clear. The Recovery Act actually made it hard, although not impossible, for private companies. There were a lot of municipal, collaborative, state research and educational networks, but many private companies did bid on those, but they were made open access, except in the circumstances you've just described. Obviously, the reverse auction gets those very much into the hands of private companies. Block grants, well, we don't know. It's going to depend on what the state structures. FCC kind of plans are sort of through other predefined distribution mechanisms. I want to focus on the point you just made about kind of getting someone to invest their equity in it, and either incumbents or new entrants. What are some ways to stimulate that in these areas that you and I know are not as served as well as they should be by incumbents, and so there's a hunger to build at higher capacities, and obviously with 65 billion, there's going to be some funds to do that. So what are some of the tools that should be deployed in designing this process from your perspective?
I'm glad you asked the question that way, because there's a fifth model, and the fifth model was in Biden's original plan when he was back on the stump running for president, and that was the electrification model. His original plan was $100 billion, mostly given out to cooperatives, because that's what the electrification model did. It said And it was stretched over a long period of time, the funding, and it said, if there's an existing co-op there today, we'll give them the money right now. And if not, we will give, rural places time to form a cooperative, and then we'll give them the money. And that's how electrification worked. It took 15 years for it to all get given out. And that model would have gone entirely to the people who would own and run the networks. And in that model, I don't know that it's that important that it's over access, because the citizens own their network. That model, very few people have ever complained about being a customer of a co-op. And so maybe you lose the open access aspect of it, but you get the citizens controlling their own destiny aspect, and there's no need for equity. It wasn't given out in electrification, it wasn't grants, it was loans. And broadband's a little more expensive, so it's probably going to have to be a mix of the two, but it's still mostly going to be loans that are paid back to the federal government over time. It's the most affordable option for the federal government because, it takes a long time, but the money comes back into the coffers. And we have these, expanding the co-op network. Co-ops are real big in some states, other states, they just never got off the ground.
Right. Will the co-op model translate into urban areas, or how would it translate?
It could. There's no reason that you couldn't have, in a large city, let's say Buffalo, New York, where you can literally draw lines around the poor neighborhoods, there's no reason that a co-op couldn't be founded there. No reason at all. Why would that not work there? Now, other than the Supreme Court challenge of Comcast to say you're competing against me unfairly, but assuming that that's allowed to be done, there's no reason an urban co-op couldn't work. Now, an urban co-op's not going to work in a smaller town where you're just going, this apartment didn't get broadband, this little street didn't get broadband. There's not enough there to put together a co-op, right? But in the large cities, there's absolutely ways to do a co-op. So,
okay. Well, we want to invite those of you who are watching into this conversation. You already are commenting and making points, and this is great. Deborah Doyle makes the point that don't forget public libraries. They're important hubs. County, city, standalone, providing free access to those who can't afford it. They're often forgotten in the planning. And we have focused this more on infrastructure, but Doug, you actually mentioned at the top of the hour that there are lots of funds through the Emergency Broadband Benefit, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, and these other programs, which we haven't talked really at all about, the other NTIA purpose. Why don't you speak a little bit about those, Doug, and how the kind of the digital equity and inclusion pieces are handled in this broadband plan or plans as we're talking?
6 or 8 weeks ago, I wrote a blog on libraries, and there's something like a dozen different funding programs for them out of this money right now. And so the answer is they are throwing a lot of money at libraries for these exact purposes. They want to give them money to buy devices so they can loan out more temporary hotspots, and just they want to make sure that they're fiber fed. And so if you do a search on pots and pans and libraries, it'll pop right up. And so and every single part of, there's another even larger list of money that's going to schools, and there's another big, of course, there's the giant money that goes directly to city and county governments who can be used for these same purposes. So I think that this current money is doing exactly that, if the local jurisdictions jump on the money and really go after it. The library money, I would hate to be a small town librarian and go, well, there's 15 different grants you can go after. It's like, well, it'll take me the entire summer just to figure out which one of those I want to use, right? And so I wish they would have just put it in one big pile, but they put it into a ton of places. But the fact is, there is a lot of money being offered for exactly those purposes. And I hope that jurisdictions figure out how to use this. Is a once in a lifetime shot to solve a lot of these problems. And so I sure hope that people do it. Yeah.
Dan asks about state interference from the fifth model, the co-op model. What by interference, I assume you mean like those who are trying to thwart it through the state level. Clarify if I've got it wrong there, Dan. But Doug, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would certainly see, the incumbents would fight tooth and nail against brand new co-ops. So yeah, and in some states, the incumbents are the state. There's certainly a lot of state legislatures, and I happen to live in a state like that in North Carolina, where the state, where charter in this state has a massive influence in the state government. And so, so this state government would come out against that idea probably. Now we have co-ops here, and they get state grants every year, but that's not the same thing as going turn the whole rural area into a pile of co-ops. I would see some states fighting that. Other states would welcome that with open arms. It's just a matter of, and it's not even a Democrat Republican thing. We see a lot of the states, a lot of the red states are already very heavily co-ops, and they love them. I mean, they love their co-ops. So yeah.
How easy or hard it will be for cities or even counties and regions to say, hey, we want to really push for an open access network for last mile access, and so we're going to go after funding to do it that way. What would you see as kind of the problems and or benefits for that approach, Doug?
The problems are, the number one problem is at this point in time, there's not very many ISPs in most part of the country to actually get on your network. And so, the best story I remember is the story of Longmont, Colorado, who was going to build an open access network, had the network under construction, literally attracted no ISPs and decided to become an ISP themselves. And since then, they've gotten a few more ISPs. They're still open access, but the ISPs don't just show up. We've sort of lost all the small independent ISPs in this country. They've either been bought out, merged, or folded, and they're mom and pop companies. And they're so in most, if you go to West Virginia and have an open access network, there isn't anybody to get on your network. There's one tiny electric co-op there, there's one tiny telephone co-op, and there's one big ISP in the state, and that's it. I mean, where the heck are these ISPs going to come from to compete with each other? So that's the number one issue. If we really built massive fiber networks, maybe we would finally talk CenturyLink and Frontier to get on other people's networks. But until that happens, it's just a hard thing to make work.
What incentives? And by the way, we always have a wide variety of people attending our calls, attending our events.
Yes.
They could be incumbents, right? But what are some of your thoughts, Doug, on enticements to get those network owners to participate in more wholesale models, right?
Well, here's the problem with the incumbents, and it's structural. It's not even their desire to do it. And I go back to the Verizon Fios story. Verizon had to create an entire new corporation, Fios, which meant new everything: switches, employees, everything for fiber. They used none of the old infrastructure, none of the old people, because their old people couldn't do it. Because in the old days, it took like 13 different people to provision a T1. And so under that kind of system, you can't change what you do for a living very easily. And so the big companies have this problem of using other people's networks because it doesn't fit their very ingrained processes. It doesn't mean they can't learn how to do it. We see CenturyLink doing that in a few places now. And so, they're doing it in, I forget the name, which of the town in Missouri, Springfield. They're doing it. So, there are places where it's possible. Once they did it, they could do it a lot of places. Once they decide that that's a sensible thing to do. We saw all the big ISPs in Europe figure it out. But, here they just haven't done it yet. So I don't know what incentive, other than the fact that, maybe if we build enough of these networks, it's a matter of them surviving.
So Bruce Wolf asks a couple of questions, different spots. One is he raises the issue of urban areas more likely to have clusters that fit these demographics, which is why the digital divide is 3 times larger in urban areas. Mm-hmm. And later, just a few moments ago, he's raised a question of costs and fees. And I'm not sure if you're talking about fiber infrastructure or sort of digital inclusion. Bruce, feel free to clarify in the chat message. But I want to get to this issue of the digital divide and really addressing bad broadband connections in cities, right? Because that in some ways it's left out of a lot of this, right? It's left out of a lot of business models of companies that have new approaches. It's left out of the rural focus of reverse auctions. I mean, maybe it'll get addressed by kind of some proposals in a grant round. But I'm just wondering, drill in a little more. What are the kind of policy levers that need to be addressed to get at this urban problem?
One is the grant money probably has to build the whole network. That's the only way to keep the rates down. And so, if they're going to put fiber into those neighborhoods that simply have very bad infrastructure, and there are urban neighborhoods where the broadband speeds are not good and they're terrible, and then they have the affordability issue. And so if you build a brand new network completely out of grant money, and now you have a good chance of having affordable rates. The other, I think, interesting idea for urban areas, and we see it in New York City. New York City has a couple large nonprofit ISPs, and they've jumped in to serve public housing and that sort of thing, and they do a good job, and they have very low rates because they're a nonprofit. And so, I think that if you were going to build those networks in cities, I believe that those kind of organizations would spring up. And so you could maybe make it so that that's sort of the urban version of a co-op. Instead of a co-op, it's a nonprofit partnership with whoever builds the infrastructure, right? So I could see that as being a viable model that would keep rates low. It's never going to get everyone in the city. Again, it's the pocket thing where, let's say a city has 20 pockets, but 8 of them are big. You build the big 8 ones. You can't get those little tiny ones this very easily. So, but you solve as much of the problem as you can with this funding. So, it's always going to be a challenge to find every single person in a city who can't make this work, but you can find the big chunks of them. So.
How important is the kind of a change definition of speed? So like, or I guess there's a way of saying is how hard should the Biden administration fight for kind of a 100 standard kind of versus other priorities? Like, and your piece from this morning, your pots and pan piece does kind of emphasize that open, affordable, or the accessible, affordable internet for all act basically both promotes open access, but also, would allow municipal networks. I think you're saying that the Bridge Act does lifts the ban on municipal participation in broadband solutions, but I take it obviously none of this is a done deal. So I guess there's two questions there: 100, how important, and other priorities that are important.
Well, we're seeing the 100 by 100 fight right now because the final Treasury rules aren't out for the ARPA money. And so there's a big fight going on about that right now. And we're going to see WISPA and every cable company arguing that we only need to fund 510 megabit upload speeds. So you can expect to see those filings by, I think it's July 15th or 14th they're due. And so there's a lot of lobbying going on to not do 100 by 100 because it shuts out certain technologies, right? So that's really a technology fight. That's a fiber fight. If we're going to do 100 by 100, that means fiber. It doesn't mean coax, and for most cases, it doesn't mean wireless. And so that's really what that boils down to. I think one of the first questions on your list was, why aren't we just saying build fiber? That's a really good question.
Yes. Let me put in another element. We would be remiss if we didn't at least speak to the 5G rollout, such as it is. Doug, you've been a noted kind of critic of a lot of the excesses, and we kind of support bringing light to all of these. But there is clearly, more attention and focus on 5G networks. And my question for you would be, like, are there ways for policy to help promote the infrastructure required to build out 5G in a way that can, have shared infrastructure, just like we already have a shared tower model for the 4G network. Are we going to continue to see that as we get to the much denser rollout necessary for towers and transceivers that will be necessary for 5G? What are your thoughts on that, Doug?
The problem there is the frequencies to do that are licensed, and so that's just helping the big, cellular companies get more customers. And so I don't know how you make that other than completely redoing our frequency policies. I don't know how you solve that problem.
Well, I'm just getting at the notion of the infrastructure, the wireless facilities, and whether, because those of course are key locus for building fiber to, right? So
well, those technologies are only really make sense where it's densely populated. So that's just never going to make sense in rural areas. You don't build a small cell site for every 2 homes. And so, that's never going to be a sensible solution. And so, but for urban areas, we're already seeing urban areas with, and remember now, there's no 5G out there yet. So I have to say that. So we finally have 4G. 5G will come in about 3 or 4 or 5 years, but we have new frequencies which are allowing faster speeds. Most cities are now seeing cellular speeds over 100 megabits. So, the speeds have drastically improved just in the last 12 months. And that's pretty decent broadband. That's not broadband built for the next 30 years. I mean, it's not gigabit broadband, but it's really good broadband, and it's going to get faster yet. But again, it's going to take those small cell sites 3 per block to get there. You know, could the federal government do that? Maybe. I mean, that's what Verizon's going to build. They say, we have to still see, they're going to build that millimeter wave stuff past 25 million homes by 2025 out of their own pocket, just like they did Fios. We'll see if they actually do it or if that's hype. But and so they're talking about speeds today of symmetrical 300 megabits, and that speed's going to get better as the technology goes through generations. So, but again, I don't. There's been no discussions of the federal government doing that. That sort of fell off of the radar a few years ago, back when we sort of got bored with the 5G discussion. So
I don't know how I missed Steve Ross's excellent comment to just build on this, and maybe we'll just put a nail in the coffin of this issue, which is, he says nationwide there are more than 2,000 tier 3 telcos, but that isn't the issue. Would not the network itself be a natural monopoly, and content providers, major carriers needing cellular backhaul, be the more typical customers? So Steve raising an excellent point there. What reaction?
No. If we built that network, we're building it for Verizon and AT&T. I mean, that's who's going to use it. They've got the licensed spectrum to take advantage of that, and I'm not sure that's bad. I mean, if in the wireless world you want it to give it to experts. I mean, there are a bunch of other wireless companies that you don't hear about, and there's little regional, wireless companies all over the country, but they're not as poised, because they're in rural areas. They're not as, this is not a rural technology. They're not really as poised to take advantage of that. But could folks pop up to do that? Sure. I mean, it's possible. If you build it, some ISPs will show up. So yeah, that's the old build it and they will come. Let's build that infrastructure and see who shows up. I'm not entirely nuts about that concept. So
let's close with a discussion about the role of municipalities. Okay, and we have talked a little bit about this through this discussion, but that was originally part of the talking points that the Biden-Harris administration released on March 31st, where they talked extensively about municipalities, cities, their role in this. And again, not saying that they all want or need or should build the networks themselves, but for those that do want to, obviously, a federal fix to the problem where dozens of states have some kind of restrictions would seem to be, in the offing. A, your thoughts on that, but B, is there some way that that there could be provisions in legislation that could make it happen more? Because again, one of the issues that we see best handled on a city level is making sure there's universal coverage, right? And the cities that have said, we want to do this, we're going to build this out, we're going to make sure everyone in our community gets covered. We may not be the provider, but we want to be the facilitator for this network. What are your thoughts on this, and any closing thoughts you have?
Well, I've worked with over 500 cities, and so I know what they're thinking, and 95% of them do not want to be an ISP. And so they're really looking, they're not against putting tax money into networks, but they want partners, or they want open access. And so, in states like mine, they can't even do that. The prohibitions here make it really hard for them to do that. And so, it's crazy to stop cities from putting money into their own city, particularly if they're looking for partners. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, especially right now when we have all this ARPA money, where in some states that's really hard to use. And so, and for the stray city who wants to do it themselves and take a shot at it, that's a taxpayer decision. Usually they have a vote on it first. And if that's what the people vote for, let them do it. That's not, it's literally 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 25 or 1 out of 30 who's even interested in that. That's not that attractive of a model to most cities. They know they're not prepared to be an ISP. But for the cities who do want to do it, there's a reason. Most of the ones who want to do it are still ones who also have a municipal electric company. So they do have a technical expertise. There's only a handful of non-electric cities who have done this or are interested in doing it. if they do it well, it's great. There's some really awesome municipal ISPs out there, and there's some failures. The funny thing about the failures is there's way more commercial failures. We just don't hear about them because they don't make the front page news like a little tiny city who has a problem. So,
Well, and in your own post on Pots and Pans yesterday, you just mentioned the AT&T business failure, so to speak, of buying high and selling low on the.
How dare AT&T ever criticize any city again after losing $90 billion in 6 years? That $90 billion could have built all this infrastructure we're talking about. So.
Well, before we thank our guest and say our program for next week, I do want to just remind everyone, and I'll put this in the chat window. We have rolled out the Broadband Breakfast Club offer for those of you who want to get more access and information. This includes special columns that come out every week. It includes invitation-only access to events. And for example, we will be launching the Broadband Breakfast Club in-person event very soon. We look forward to welcoming Broadband Breakfast Club members to attend and participate in person and enjoy a meal with us in person, in addition to obviously our online events, which we will continue. And you get special discounts on events like the Broadband Community Summit and the Digital Infrastructure Investment Mini Conference taking place in September 27th through 30th. I put the link in for all of you on the Zoom session. It's broadbandbreakfast.com/join for the rest of you, and you can learn more about it. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them to membership@breakfast.media. I want to finally just plug what we're going to be doing next week. On July 7th, we'll be talking about broadband mapping is back, and in particular, some of the new developments by the National Telecommunications Information Administration on broadband mapping. And then on July 14th, 2 weeks from today, we'll be talking about spectrum sharing in the 12 gigahertz band. The following week, July 21st, we will be doing the first of 3 events jointly with Broadband Communities in preparation for the upcoming Broadband Community Summit. With that, I just want to thank you all for being with us for this hour, particularly thank our guest, Doug Dawson, president of CCG Consulting, for being with us, and thanks to each of you for spending this time with us. We'll see you again next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care.
And I just wanted to say a last thanks to you, Drew, because you asked good questions today, and I literally think we talked about 90 different topics today.
Well, it certainly seems that way. And thank you for your blog and for staying involved in this topic. We will see you around, and we'll see you all next week, Wednesday at 12.